Welcome to the PAM Great Lakes Region webinar on handbell maintenance by Kathleen Ebling Shaw from Malmark. She's the Vice President at Malmark, and she's adjunct instructor at Westminster Choir College of Rider University. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes until we have a few more participants, and then we'll turn it over to Kathy. But glad you're here, and thanks for participating in this webinar. Okay, let's go ahead. I'll turn it over to Kathy. If you happen to have questions throughout Kathy's presentation, please put those questions in the Q&A box, and I'll try to field those questions to Kathy. Kathy, welcome and thank you.
Oh, thanks for having us, and welcome everyone. Greetings from Plumsteadville. I'm here in the Malmark conference room, and it's my pleasure to share with you some ideas about maintenance today. So I just want to make sure that you can see everything as I'm going and can hear me. I'm on a smaller window, so I'm not seeing my own view here. Okay, but we'll start with talking about the Malmark handbell. So of course, just to quickly go over the parts of the handbell, we have the casting, which is 80% copper and 20% tin. It's not lacquered or coated in any way. And of course, I have to reiterate here, being a manufacturer, that the salts and oils in the skin of our hands do stain the bronze castings. And basically the salts and the oils etch into the bronze. So it's important to keep your bells well polished, your castings well polished, so that the castings don't stain. If they do stain, they would have to be machine polished. We don't like to do that too frequently because the bells are tuned by the thickness of the casting. And as we machine polish, we thin down the casting, and eventually we would detune the casting. So it's really important. Gloves are an important thing. I know they're not very popular these days, but we can't reiterate enough how important it is to wear gloves. So I have a G4 here, and just want to talk about the casting a little bit. Malmark bells are designed to ring 2 pitches, the fundamental near the lip of the casting, and then the 12th at the waist of the casting. And the reason for that is when Mr. Malta was designing the bell, he wanted to create a profile of a bell, but he wanted the instrument itself to be very consonant. When Mr. Malta first designed the Schulmerich bells in 1963, he called together a lot of the leaders of the handbell movement at that time, and they all said that they wanted to get away from ringing just melody lines and wanted to ring chords. And so he understood that it was important that the bell be in tune with itself before it could be in tune with chords. So I'm ringing the bell on medium right now. And when you hear it, I'll touch the lip and you should, can you hear a higher pitch coming through? I don't know if the computer can pick that up. Dave, do you hear it?
Yes, it's not resonating as long as.
Okay.
I don't know if that's,
That may be a little better. Okay, so we have the fundamental coming from the lip and then the 12th in the overtone series. So it's an octave and a half above. He certainly couldn't have an octave fundamental here and an octave here. He wouldn't have the bell shape. So he stretched it out to a 12th. So this is G4. We jump up an octave to G5. And then the fifth in the scale of G would be B6. So G5, A5, B5, C6, D6. B6 is the second pitch that's coming from the bell. So it's very important to us when we pull a set of bells together that we match the D6 bell to the D6 in the G4 bell and work in a circle of fifths there. It's very important to you as a ringer, as a director maybe, to teach your ringers that they should, when they damp, they just don't want to damp the lip of the bell, which we see very often at festivals, but they want to damp the entire wall of the casting to the bell so that we damp the fundamental and the overtone. So in order to have a prominent fundamental and a prominent overtone, the center of the bell is very thin, so the other pitches in that profile cannot be heard. So we would want to be concerned about that basically when we are malleting, okay? So when we're striking the casting with a mallet, we want to make sure that we just don't have a bullseye in our mind at the center of the casting and strike the mallet in the center of the casting. We want to strike closer to the lip because it's thicker there. And we want the fundamental pitch to be heard rather than the overtone. So on all of the castings, the center of the casting is thinner so that those notes aren't heard. If you use the analogy, heavy metal creates a lot of sound. The thicker the casting, the louder it is. That's why Whitechapel bells are louder, and also they are heavier because they have much thicker walls than the American bells. That was another thing that the leaders said at the time, that they wanted a lighter bell. And they also wanted the clapper to be recessed in the casting, not extended out of the casting. So a couple of things there. So we
Could you
say,
show again, lift up the bell and show where you would strike with the mallet, because that was kind of.
oh,
wrong.
sure. We would want to strike right under the lip, especially with yarn. You don't want to strike on the lip because the lip tends to cut the mallet yarn. But if you strike right under the lip, you should be good. But you don't want to strike in the center. I know as directors, we're just happy that our ringers get the right note at the right time, but it's time to get them to focus on where they're striking as well. Your lower fourth and fifth octave bells from C3 all the way up to B3 have thinner walls than the higher bells. So you'll want to really use caution with those. The castings sound an octave higher than what we read in the score. So for instance, G4, we're reading it as top space bass, but it really sounds as second line G5. The reason why everything is read an octave lower is so that we don't have to read so many ledger lines. Castings are in tune as long as they are not cracked, all right? So there are two properties of the casting. One is the tuning, the second is the tonal quality. So if I use the example that I could sing the same pitch as Lady Gaga, but it would be two different voices, two different sound qualities, but it would be the same pitch. And that's the way bells work as well. So here at Malmark, we like to we like to choose our bells that have more straight tone rather than vibrato. And we reject 40% of the bells that we make due to vibrato. This is a reject I just pulled out of the factory this morning. You can hear again. I don't know how our speaker is. It has a little flutter in the sound. And so this is a reject casting. So we are very careful about vibrato in the sets so that your sets don't sound out of tune. The one thing that you do have to recognize is that bells are being of higher pitches are just like sopranos and tenors, and they develop vibrato over the years. And I'll speak to that a little bit later when we talk about the voicing of the casting. Does anyone have, oh, I should mention about temperature. We tune at 70 degrees. If you're invited to go out into the town square and ring at the Christmas tree lighting and it's 25 degrees, you are fine to do that. We recommend that you don't ring on the hard setting. You would ring on medium, and that you don't do any stop sounds because the casting is brittle in colder temperatures. The other thing, unfortunately, is that the tuning of the casting is going to go sharp in cold weather and flat in warm weather. So you definitely don't want to program bells and voices together during that Christmas tree lighting. But you're fine to ring outdoors in heat or in colder temperatures. In the heat, you just want to keep the bells out of the sun so your handles don't lose their shape. Are there any questions before I begin? Okay, I'm going to go through the parts of the handbell and also put you on a general maintenance schedule just to keep for your bells. Now, at Malmark, we don't send out a toolkit because it's basic tools that Mr. Malta thought everybody had. So I'll just show you what I'm having here. For the main assembly screw, I just have a straight edge screwdriver, longer length. For the restraining springs, I have a 1/4 inch straight edge screwdriver. For the handle screws, I have 2 short shafted #2 Phillips head drivers. And then for any kind of restraining springs that we need to replace, I have what we call a screw holding driver that will allow you to change the restraining spring without taking the complete bell apart. All right. So we have the first screw that is important in the bell is the main assembly screw. That is the screw that goes through the loop of the handle into the clapper assembly. This is known as the, I refer to it as the spinal cord of the bell. This screw needs to be tight at all times. The one thing about it is, though, that on your upper bells, from D sharp 6 on up, you don't want to over tighten that screw because sometimes that cuts down on the sustain of your higher bells. So if you have a higher bell that doesn't seem to linger as much as others, you may want to check the main assembly screw. Maybe someone was helping you out and tightened it too much. So the main assembly screw, like I said, holds the entire instrument together. And it is the one screw that loosens first when the bell rings because the bell is a vibrating instrument. So just as you have screws loosened on your car or your lawnmower or snow blower, you'll have screws loosened on your bells as well, just because of the vibration of the instrument. So the main assembly screw, I usually, what I'll do is I'll recommend give someone a straight edge screwdriver. And we all have that person that may show up 15 or 20 minutes before rehearsal and like to chat it up with you. And sometimes you're still trying to get your rehearsal plans together. So a wise thing to do might be is just give them a straight edge screwdriver and have them go through the handbell set once every 3 months or so, just to make sure those main assembly screws are loose. Now, the beauty about this is then you never have to worry about the casting going flying off the handle. That's the only way it can happen with a Malmark bell, is if that main assembly screw does break, then the casting would roll off. We get, I wouldn't say one call every week, but a couple times a month on a Monday morning, our phone here rings early in the morning, and then we hear a story about what happened in worship yesterday. So again, the main assembly screw is the most important screw. Any questions before we move on? Okay. All right, so the main assembly screw is a little bit longer. I'm struggling with it. It wants to stay in this handle block here. But we have it going through the handle. And then with the handbell, we're next going to remove the hand guard. Can you all see? All right, so I'm taking off the hand guard. All right, and then underneath that hand guard is what we call a lock washer, and it's stuck to the hand guard right now. It's right on the hand guard there, the silver teeth. Okay, the screw. There we go. Here's our lock washer. What this lock washer does is we have one above the casting, and then we take off the casting, and we have one below the casting. And the only function of these lock washers is that they separate the clapper assembly and the hand guard from touching the casting so that the casting freely vibrates, so it has a longer sustain. A longer sustain. If the hand guard was sitting right on the casting without that lock washer in there, it would cut down on the vibration. So it just gives it a little bit longer cycle. So basically we have the handle, the hand guard, lock washer above the casting, lock washer below the casting onto the clapper assembly. And that is the complete assembly of the bell. As long as once you understand the function of each part, I think it's pretty easy to put together and take apart. Any questions? No. Okay. So now we're just working with the clapper assembly. The clapper assembly has basically three functioning parts. We first have the clapper head, and it does rotate from soft, medium, and hard from G3 up to D#6. And then on our C3 to F#3, we have 4 positions. And then E6 on up, it only has 2 positions, soft and hard. So usually not too much goes wrong with the clapper head. Occasionally you'll have a loose clapper head screw, or if you have a clapper head screw that won't stay tight, what I would recommend is that you try the screw first, because it's a brass screw and that's a little bit softer and the threads tend to break a little bit. So what we like to do is, if you have a clapper head screw that won't stay tight, we'll try to replace the screw first. If not, then we have to replace the clapper shaft and the yoke assembly. But basically on your G3 to A#4 bells, you have the felt strip setting. Those are there for the softer settings so that you get very little overtone and just fundamental pitch. If you have a worn felt, you can do 2 things. You can maybe during the summertime when you're not using your bells, send your clapper heads into us and we will refelt them for you. Or we can, if you're handy, we can send you some felt stripping, and it just requires the tip of a screwdriver, straight edge screwdriver, just to get the felt down into the slot, and then a hot glue gun to seal. So the different clapper head settings are not just a volume control, but they're also a quality control for tonality. The softer setting does not excite the 12th overtone as much as the medium setting does, or as much as the hard setting does. We really don't like our bells on the hard setting. We don't like the sound of them, but we understand it's important for them to be there when you're playing with organ and brass on Easter Sunday, if you're playing outdoors, or for other times when you're using a lot of musical forces. All right, so we have the clapper head. I should just mention also that under the clapper head, in the lower bells from G3 to A#4, the same bells that have the felt, they have a weight on them. The reason that weight is there to help the clapper head fall towards the casting. It would not fall on its own. It needs a little bit more weight there. All right, the second function on this clapper head are the adjustable bearing screws. They are on the side of the yoke, and that is why you receive a 5/64 hex key with your handbell set. They're right here. And what these bearing screws allow us to do is they allow us for the clapper to respond to the snap of your wrist. When Malmark bells first came out, they just had pins there. And there was no way to really control the action to give you a really finite control with dynamics as well as precision accuracy. So Mr. Malta did switch his design to bearing screws, and so that's why we use the hex key. They're also on our chimes, which we'll talk about as well. Now, bearing screws have a really good memory. They very rarely get loose. I would say I like to recommend to folks maybe once every 2 to 3 years, depending how much you use your bells, that you would actually go into the parish hall, spread out tables, spread out a roll of white paper, and then I suggest to folks they get a black magic marker. They lay the C4 bell down on the white paper, draw a line, then the C#4, draw a line, and leave space to work. And then you completely disassemble your bells for the primary reason of polishing the inside and the outside of the casting. Malmark handbells do have a jeweler's finish on the inside and out, and that's where we do our final tuning on the inside of the casting. So over the years, they will get some dust at the bottom, and they also do tarnish. So I like to do it maybe once every 3 years, but having the paper and the tables out really help not mix up any parts with the bell. And that's a great time just to take the clapper assembly and just, if the bearing screws are flat with the yoke, that's a good adjustment. So that's when you just want to check your bearing screws. Now, if you have a bell that you feel isn't as responsive as it might be, I have a half bell here. You can take your bell fully assembled and just rock it east to west. If you feel that clapper moving east to west, that means your bearing screws might be a little loose. So, but normally you would want to take it apart to tighten those. And then finally, the problem at the bottom, or the function at the bottom, would be the restraining springs. And what the restraining springs do is when I tighten the screw, it causes the spring to fold up, and then it stops the yoke from rocking over. So that's how we determine the distance of the clapper head to the casting. And I will say that when I'm out in the field, I find that most people have their restraining springs too tight. So we like them a little bit looser here so that you can play with a great piano. If your restraining springs are too tight, you really have to use a strong flick of the wrist. Your ringers have to work too hard, and then you don't have the subtlety in the bell to do a wide range of dynamics. So I know a lot of people, as they become more experienced in ringing, they like them tighter and tighter and tighter because they're building up their muscles. But we want to try to keep them a little bit more fluid so we have wonderful nuance. So with the bell, there's two things that commonly crack, and that the first would be your restraining spring. If you have a lot of restraining springs cracking, it would mean that they're definitely adjusted too tightly. The other thing is that our handles don't break, but the outside exterior of the extrusion does crack, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I'll just talk to you about the restraining spring. If you go to Ace Hardware, they sell, or anywhere that sells Craftsman tools, and you may be able to find them in another brand. I've always just recommended Sears Craftsman, but I know that's no longer an option. But you can get a screw holding driver. So while the bell is still, I don't know if you can see this, while the bell is still fully assembled, you can put the driver into the bell. And then grab the screw. We'll pretend this spring is cracked and take it out. Okay, so now I have one spring missing in my bell. And what I'm going to do is I have a brand new replacement spring here. I'm going to put it in the center hole of my spring, and then you push this clip down and it holds on to the spring for you as well as the screw. And I need my reading glasses. I'm getting old. Okay, so. So this will hold on. Whoops, no, it won't. You have a good job, Dave?
What was that?
I said, do you have a good joke to tell while I do this? Okay, here we are. So this is my spring on my screw holding driver. And normally we would have it down like this and just go in with the spring and tighten up the screw. There we go. So there we are. We're tightening it,
Can you lift up just a little bit? There you go.
and it's in there. Okay, sorry. Thanks for your patience, friends. Okay, so does anyone have any questions with the clapper assembly before I begin to put the bell back together?
Don't see any.
Okay, so we're going to move forward. And when you have the clapper assembly in front of you, you usually have the back side of the spring a little bit tighter so you don't have a back ring when you damp, correct? So we're going to look at our springs right now, and this is the front side and this is the back side. So I'm going to put the front side away from my body, and I'm going to assemble the bell with my clapper assembly, my external tooth lock washer, my handbell casting. I'm not worried about the strike point of where it is right now. I'm just getting that casting on there. Then I have my second lock washer to separate the casting. Now my hand guard, you only have two choices when you put on your hand guard because it has a square in the center rather than a circular opening. So I'm going to put Malmark to the right. And now I'm going to put my handle with the colophon, the maker's mark, facing away from me, putting in the main assembly screw, which is there. And now I'm going to tighten, but I won't tighten all the way because we have to line up the clapper assembly with the strike point. When you choose a straight edge screwdriver to tighten your main assembly screw, you want to make sure that the shaft is long enough so that you can get it through the loop of the handle. And you'll feel some resistance when you're tightening the main assembly screw. And that's when I'm going to stop for now. No, I'm not feeling enough resistance. Okay, so right now I'm looking around the casting and I'm looking for my strike point. Oftentimes you'll find it easily because you'll see a little markup from the clapper in the casting, and right here is the strike point. So I will definitely tighten up the main assembly screw so the clapper falls on the strike point. But before I do, I just wanted to explain, we talked earlier about vibrato with the bells. So all bells work in quadrants, meaning that when you strike the bell here, it will sound exactly alike 180 degrees across the casting. So when you shake, you will always get the same tone because the clapper is striking 180 degrees of the casting. So that means that only a quarter of the wall of the casting sounds different. And when we have the bells on the lathe and in the polishing room, we always constantly check the tuning. But once we check the tuning, we then have to listen to the tonal characteristic of the bell. And even though the bells are in tune, they are still rejects because of the amount of vibrato in them. And that's where this comes in. The bells go into a voicing room where they're literally just struck very slowly around the wall of the casting. Oop, my spring is too tight, sorry. Okay. And what we do is we listen to the bell all the way around. You can hear that's has a little bit more flutter in it. That's a little bit straighter. So anyway, when your bells have the strike point, that's when we voice the bell. We found the best tonal quality to be on the bell. But as the bell rings over the years and the molecules in the metal change due to vibration, that tonal quality may change. But please know, you can just loosen your main assembly screw and you can turn the casting to a better place. You don't have to send it to us for revoicing. Now, if you're uncomfortable in doing that, you most certainly can send your bell to us to be revoiced, but it's not necessary. If you take a little bit extra polish on your rag, you can polish out that strike point, and just using a flexible straight edge and a paring knife, you can put a new strike point in the casting of your bell. Any questions on that, friends? Okay. Okay, so there we are. We're going to go in and just adjust the springs now that the bell is tight. So the way I like to adjust springs is that when I hold the bell, I open my bottom 3 fingers and let the weight of the casting fall forward. If the bell doesn't ring lightly, okay, then the springs are too tight. So this is a very nice setting just by letting the weight of the bell determine the springs. I haven't checked this bell, so we'll just see. Okay, it does, when you drop it forward, it does ring, and that's a great way to check it. Finally, friends, the one thing that you do have to do is replace handles when you have a cracked one. Our policy is you just have to send us a photo of the cracked handle. We do like the crack to be across the entire width of the handle. Otherwise, the handle still has a little life in it, or if a hand guard would happen to crack, Now you might say, how does a handguard crack? It's usually from putting the bell into the pocket of the bell and being in a hurry to get out of rehearsal, and someone closes the lid and the bell's not all the way in that little pocket. So sometimes handguards do crack as well. But you just use the two number 2 Phillips head screwdrivers. We're going to use one on one side of the screw and the second one on the other. And basically you hold one stationary and you tighten or loosen as needed to replace the handle by using the 2 Phillips heads. Does anyone have any questions on the bell?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, so now we're going to quickly address choir chimes. Choir chimes were first created in 1982. It was Mr. Malta's, and he quickly saw that schools just didn't have the money to buy handbells as we had all hoped, and that we needed to come up with another instrument to introduce the whole concept of ringing. And so that's where he came up with the choir chime. It's just basic aluminum tubing. On the side of the tube, there's the slot that's cut to a specific length, just like a tuning fork. And that determines the tuning of the chime. Inside the tube, there's a plug, and that creates a resonating chamber from the bottom of the chime to the plug, and that controls the volume of the chime. So if you have a chime that's out of tune, then you would know that the length of the chime has changed, and usually that's by a crack. If you have a chime that's in tune but doesn't have a lot of resonance or volume, then you may want to consider sending it in to make sure that the plug is in the correct place. So there's very little maintenance to do with chimes. Number one, you don't have to wear gloves with them. I just recommend using a disposable disinfectant wipe, either Lysol, Clorox, or store brand, whatever, to wipe the tubes down occasionally. The clapper assembly is very similar to that in the handbell. Right here, you see your bearing screws, and they are adjusted in the same manner with the 564 hex. Again, once they're set, they're usually set most of the time, but if you do have any east to west motion, then check your bearings. The one thing that most folks don't recognize about the chimes is the bumper. The bumper is the round disc at the bottom of the clapper shaft. Sometimes when I visit folks, I sometimes see the bumper up the shaft, and it should always be at the bottom of the shaft. The center hole that surrounds the shaft of the clapper is drilled off center. So I can rotate this bumper and raise and lower the distance of the clapper head to my chime. And that's like the restraining spring of the chime. So that's going to give you the flexibility when you ring. You want it to be right at the right position. And again, if you drop forward, the chime rings lightly, then you're good. I think it's a little loose. I'm just going to turn it again. That's a little tight. And there we go with the chimes. So the chimes, you can damp at any point on the chime, and the entire instrument will damp. So our original model was created from 1982 to 1994. And we just in the recent years ran out of parts from that original model that we can no longer refurbish those, but we will offer you a discount on a replacement set. That original model does not have a clapper assembly like this. Any chime purchased after October of 1994 has this up-to-date current model. Now, the one thing that we did change later in the years is your C4 to B4 have felt clapper heads originally, and we changed to the rubber clapper heads. So if you still have felts down in your bass chimes, you may want to consider changing them. Number one, they're probably very old and they've softened so much that you're not getting a lot of sound from those chimes. And so we can sell you a conversion kit that's very inexpensive for these rubber clapper heads, and they provide a really nice sound and a really nice response point. The only
Kathy,
other
I have a
thing,
question.
yes.
So I've seen on chime sets that I've worked on for other people, that the bumper guard, some people have raised the bumper guard up, the shaft, and talk about that if you will. That
Okay, so they've
placement
they've
should remain.
slid the bumper up the shaft
Right.
in hopes to control the distance. The
Right.
bumper should always be at the base of the shaft. And
Thank
I
you.
will tell you that in that original model, that's how you did control
Right.
the distance of the clapper head to the tube. But that time, the bumper was rectangular and you would slide up and down. But now with the round bumper, we keep it at the base and we just rotate. Again, you can see. So if you have a clapper head that's touching the tube, what's going to happen is the clapper head will damp the tube. So then it's out, you say, gee, it must be cracked or something, it's not ringing. But if I just raise the clapper head off the tube, I get a beautiful sound. The only other thing that can happen with chimes is sometimes your thumb guard would become loosened. It would take a lot of force for that to happen, but you would have to peel off the label, the thumb guard label, and there's just 2 screws underneath that you would tighten, and then give us a ring and we'll send you a replacement label there. And that's basically it for chimes. I will say that why do chime tubes crack? The reason they would crack, and they usually crack at the base of the tine, they crack when the tines bend in. So anything from, I would say, C4 to C8, anything above that, if your bottom tine is bent in, it's an indication that you've been marding the chimes. And we really suggest you don't use the martelato technique with the chimes. Very, very infrequently, we may see where the top tine has bent down, all right? And that's just from overzealous ringing, but that's not often. We just see that a lot of times, especially in schools, they want the hand chime to function like a handbell. So they do all the stop techniques on them, and then therefore the tubes do crack. I do have to address the lower 6th and 7th octaves. Those are struck with a mallet. So our hand holding a mallet hits the chime tube with much more force than a fixed clapper does. The other thing is that the lower 6th and 7th octave chimes from C2 to B2 are really like a subwoofer for the upper octaves. When you strike them, they don't produce a lot of sound. If you on your stereo, if you turned off the speakers and just had the subwoofer, you wouldn't hear anything. And that's essentially how those lower chimes function. But what they do is when those lower chimes are rung under the 5-octave set of chimes, it opens up a very strong fundamental, an octave below, and makes those chimes sound much richer. When you have a C major chord, C, C, G maybe in the bass, and then lots of C, E, Gs above it, oftentimes folks will just play the C2 and double down under that C3. You will not get the sound that you are looking for because it really needs, you can never, an octave is not enough. You need a smaller interval between the C2 and the C3. So if it's a C major chord, we would add in the G2 and play C2, G2, and then C3. If it were an F major chord in a 6/4 position, C would be the root, but we would add the F2 in, or yes, we would add the C2 and the F2 under the C3 to fill in the chords. So what we're finding is we have folks who are either striking too much or not or not filling in the octave, and that's why we're getting the cracked tubes in the lower octaves. I know that these special instruments don't really mean a whole lot to everybody, so I didn't want to spend too much time on them. But if you do have questions, feel free to give us a ring on that. Are there any other questions?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, I'll just say one last thing, and that would be I'll speak to refurbishing. I read overtones like everybody else does, and I sometimes have to giggle at the ads. If your bells haven't been refurbished in the past 5 years, it's time. That is not true. We think that everyone really should be able to polish their bells on their own. And with that in mind, that if you refurbish every 10 to 15 years, depending on, if you have one bell choir, if you have 4 or 5, you may need to refurbish more on the 10-year spot than the 15-year spot. And with refurbishing, what we're going to do, the 2 key components is we want to try to remove stains so that your castings look better. But the real thing that refurbishing is so important to us is because we go ahead and we revoice the bells. So we're going to find the point on the casting where there's the least amount of vibrato. And my particular handbell set that I use at Westminster Choir College is almost is 43 years old. So it has changed over the years because of the work it's gotten. It has changed over the years because my ringers forehand and Shelley, and they lose their grip, and the lip of 2 bells can strike one another. And once you have a nick in the lip of the casting, that can change the sound of the bells. So, with forehand and Shelley, sometimes your ringers just lose a grip and we get 2 bells striking one another. And that will affect the tone of the bells. So refurbishing is so important because of the tonal work. And we hope that you would consider sending them back to the factory because your castings have a lifetime warranty as long as there's not a whole lot of misuse or a whole lot of nicks in the lip of the castings, but to allow us to bring your set up to good sound again would be most important.
Kathy, thank you so much. This has been very informational for all of us. It's really fantastic. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining in, everyone, and have a great day. Happy March.
Before we say farewell, join us next week, March 8th at 1 p.m. And Beth Ann Neely will be here from Schumerick, Carolina, to tell us about maintenance on Schumerick bells.
Dave,
Yes.
I did see there was a question here about maintenance.
I just
Okay.
saw.
So on Malmark's website under service, we have a complete video of, and it's broken out into chapters. So if you say, oh, I don't remember how to replace the spring or replace the handle, you can choose the different part to go to that. But also under service, under forms, you can download our maintenance manuals. So they're there for you. If you have trouble finding them, just give us a ring and we can send it to you by email.
That's great. Any other questions before we hear something else? Oh, Ann Wood is just saying many thanks for a very informative webinar. Robin said, great, thank you.
Great.
And if you have other suggestions for webinars for the Pan Great Lakes region, we would love to hear from you. So you can contact Ann Wood, President, myself as Vice President. If you go to the PAM website and under our region for Great Lakes, all of our emails are in that on the website. Thank you again, and thank you to Kathy.
Thank you all. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.